Clara stood behind the counter of the diner, her tired eyes scanning the room as the clattering of plates and the chatter of customers filled the air. Her shift had already dragged on for hours, each moment blending into the next, but she had learned to mask her exhaustion with a practiced smile. She wore her brown hair in a messy ponytail, her uniform slightly disheveled, but none of it mattered in this world of greasy spoons and late-night meals. The diner was a small, worn-out establishment in the heart of the city, but it was home for Clara. It was her reality, and she had long accepted it. The constant buzz of orders and the click of heels on the linoleum floors kept her moving. She darted between tables, balancing trays of food, her mind racing with worries of unpaid bills and her mother's worsening health. When Clara reached table 5, she stopped in her tracks. The man sitting there stood out like a beacon of elegance among the mismatched booths and cracked tile floors. His gray hair, meticulously combed, matched his tailored suit that looked too pristine for the shabby diner. He sat alone, his piercing blue eyes scanning the menu with a quiet intensity. "Spaghetti and meatballs, please," he said, his voice deep but calm, a stark contrast to the cacophony around them. Clara smiled politely, noting that his order seemed out of place. The meal, simple and hearty, was a far cry from the gourmet dishes that his appearance suggested he might prefer. It intrigued her, but she pushed the thought aside, noting the generous tip he had left before he even ordered. After serving his food, Clara turned to leave, but the man's voice stopped her. "Excuse me, miss," he said. "Would you care to sit for a while? I'd enjoy some company." Clara hesitated. It was rare for anyone to ask for more than just a quick interaction. "I'm sorry, I've got a lot of orders to take care of," she replied quickly, already stepping back. But then, sensing the loneliness in his eyes, she added, "I'll check back in a bit, though." A few minutes later, with a lull in the rush, Clara returned to his table. She refilled his water, and they began to chat. His name was Harold Caldwell, an elderly businessman, though he didn't elaborate much on the details. Instead, he asked about her life. How long had she worked at the diner? Was she planning to stay in the city? Was her family nearby? The conversation flowed easily, despite the underlying sadness that lingered in her words. She spoke of her mother, her struggles with medical bills, and how she had been working 2 jobs to make ends meet. Harold listened intently, his gaze never wavering. He didn't offer sympathy, but there was something about him that made her feel seen. She was used to polite conversation with strangers, but this was different. He seemed to genuinely care. When the conversation ended, Harold reached into his jacket pocket and slid a business card across the table. "If you ever need anything, feel free to reach out," he said, his tone kind but firm. "And one last thing," he gestured toward the tip jar. "For your troubles." Clara stared at the card in shock. A business card from one of the wealthiest men in the city? And then she saw the tip, a sum so large that it made her hands tremble. She had never seen so much money at once, and her mind raced. Could it be real? Could this man actually change her life? Clara's phone rang early the next morning, waking her from a restless sleep. She groggily answered it, only to hear Harold's voice on the other end. "Good morning, Clara. I hope I'm not disturbing you too early," he said, his voice smooth and calm. "I'd like to discuss something with you, if you're willing. I think it could be of great benefit to both of us." Her heart skipped a beat. Was he serious? What could someone like him want with her? After a brief conversation, Harold invited her to his mansion for a private meeting. He assured her there was no need to dress up, just come as she was. Clara stood outside Harold's grand estate later that week, staring up at the massive gates that seemed to stretch endlessly into the sky. It felt surreal, as if she had somehow wandered into a world she wasn't meant to be a part of. The mansion itself was imposing, with its marble columns and perfectly manicured lawns. She felt like a fish out of water, overwhelmed by the opulence that surrounded her. Harold greeted her at the door with his usual calm demeanor, offering her a seat in the lavish sitting room. The high ceilings, antique furniture, and expensive paintings on the walls made her feel even more out of place. Harold didn't waste any time. He got straight to the point. "I'm in need of a wife, Clara," he said, his words straightforward but not cold. "Not for love, but for a mutually beneficial arrangement." My health is declining, and I need someone to be there for me in my final years. I've watched you, and I see potential in you. More than just a waitress, more than someone who is merely surviving." Clara blinked, unsure of what to say. Her mind raced, trying to process his words. I don't understand. You're asking me to marry you?" "Yes," Harold replied without hesitation, "but I'm not asking for love. I will provide financial security for you and your family, including your mother's medical bills, as long as you offer me your companionship. I need someone to help manage the estate, assist with my projects, and, most importantly, help me leave behind a legacy that will last." Clara's mind whirled. She thought of her mother's failing health, the piles of bills that seemed impossible to pay, and the gnawing fear that her life would never change. This proposition was tempting. No more struggling, no more wondering how she would make ends meet. But the weight of the decision hung heavy on her heart. Was she willing to sacrifice her autonomy for security? Harold's steady gaze didn't waver, and Clara could see that he wasn't making this offer lightly. She knew she didn't have much choice. Her mother's health, her financial struggles, it all came rushing to the forefront of her mind. "Give me some time to think about it," she said quietly, her voice almost breaking. "Of course," Harold said, his voice reassuring. "Take all the time you need. But remember, time is something neither of us has much of." Clara left the mansion that day with a heavy heart. The decision she had to make wasn't just about money. It was about her future, her family, and what she was willing to sacrifice for a chance at a better life. She knew that whatever choice she made, there was no going back. Clara returned to Harold's mansion the next day, her resolve firm but her heart still heavy with uncertainty. She had spent the night weighing her options, imagining the weight of what this arrangement would mean for her future. But when she thought of her mother's pale face and the stack of overdue bills, the decision became clearer. She couldn't continue to live in this state of constant fear. The offer, though unconventional, was an opportunity she could not afford to turn down. As she drove up to the mansion once again, Clara felt a strange sense of inevitability. The towering gates opened before her like the entrance to a different world, and she was ushered inside with a quiet elegance that she was still trying to understand. Harold was waiting for her in his study, the same calm composure on his face, though today there was a slight tension in his posture, a sense that this moment was significant for both of them. He motioned for Clara to sit across from him at a grand wooden desk, papers neatly arranged in front of him. "I've prepared the terms of our agreement," Harold said, his voice steady and authoritative. "This will be a formal arrangement, Clara. We both know that this is not about emotions or romance. It's about security, stability, and mutual respect. I will provide for you and your family in ways that you couldn't imagine. You will help me manage my estate and support my philanthropic endeavors. In return, you will have the peace of mind to focus on what matters most." Clara listened closely, each word carrying the weight of a lifetime of uncertainty. She could feel the gravity of what was being offered: financial security, a place in this sprawling mansion, and the chance to change everything for her mother. But at what cost? The thought lingered, but she couldn't afford to entertain it any longer. The terms were clear. No romantic expectations, no illusions of love, just companionship in a shared existence. When Clara hesitated, Harold's gaze softened, as if he understood the battle raging inside her. "You're doing this because you care about your family," he said gently, "and I will help you. You don't have to carry this burden alone anymore." She nodded, though her stomach twisted at the thought of what she was agreeing to. A part of her still wanted to run, to escape from this overwhelming reality. But the rational part of her knew there was no other choice. Her future, and her mother's, depended on it. 2 weeks later, Clara stood in front of a modest altar in Harold's lush garden, dressed in a simple white gown. The ceremony was intimate, just a few close associates, a small gathering that felt more like a business transaction than a wedding. Harold was there, of course, dressed impeccably in a dark suit, his demeanor calm and poised as ever. There were no grand gestures, no romantic declarations, just a quiet exchange of vows that felt more like an agreement than a promise. Clara's heart was heavy as she spoke her vows. They were words she had rehearsed in her mind, but they felt foreign coming from her lips. She wasn't promising love, nor was she committing to anything more than a duty. But there was a certain comfort in knowing that, for once, her life had a direction, however complicated that direction might be. When the ceremony ended, she followed Harold back into the mansion. It was strange, stepping into a world that didn't belong to her, a life she could barely understand. Her mind was filled with questions, doubts, and the flickering hope that this choice would bring her the peace and security she so desperately needed. But for now, there was only silence and the weight of the decision she had made. The days following the ceremony felt surreal to Clara. Living in Harold's mansion was a world apart from the life she had known. The sprawling estate seemed to stretch on forever, with perfectly manicured gardens and opulent rooms that took her breath away. The house was quiet, almost too quiet, with the sound of her footsteps echoing in the vast hallways. Clara had never been in a place like this before. Nothing in her past could have prepared her for the grandeur that surrounded her now. At first, she spent her mornings in a haze, unsure of what to do with herself. Harold was often away on business or preoccupied with his various projects, and Clara was left to navigate this new life on her own. The mansion's staff were polite, but there was an underlying sense of distance, as though they too saw her as an outsider. She had always prided herself on being independent, but here, in this enormous house, she felt small, almost invisible. During the afternoons, Clara wandered the estate, exploring the gardens and the library, trying to find some semblance of comfort in the unfamiliar surroundings. It was easy to feel lost in such a vast, quiet place, and she often found herself longing for the chaos of the diner, where at least she had a purpose and a sense of belonging. But then, one afternoon, everything changed. Clara had wandered into Harold's study, drawn by the faint sound of his voice. She had always been curious about his work, but she had never had the courage to ask him about it directly. Today, however, she found herself standing at the door, watching him as he negotiated a business deal over the phone. Harold's sharp mind and commanding presence were impossible to ignore. He was no mere wealthy old man. He was a force to be reckoned with. His voice was steady, his words precise, as he discussed investments, philanthropic ventures, and future projects. Clara had never seen this side of him before, and it fascinated her. This wasn't the man who had offered her a lifeline. This was someone completely different, someone who commanded respect, who had built an empire, and who would leave a lasting mark on the world. For the first time since arriving at the mansion, Clara felt a flicker of admiration for him. There was something deeply compelling about Harold, something that went beyond his wealth or his position. He was driven, purposeful, and his work meant something more than just making money. He was creating opportunities, building a legacy. As the conversation ended and Harold turned to face her, Clara felt a sudden shift. She no longer saw him just as the man who had provided her with a roof over her head. She saw him as someone who had purpose, someone who was changing the world in his own way. And for the first time, she wondered if perhaps she could learn from him. Maybe this life, this strange, complicated life, could offer her more than she had ever imagined. "Clara," Harold said, his voice softening as he noticed her standing in the doorway. "I didn't mean to interrupt your day, but I do hope you're starting to see that there is more to this life than what you've known." Clara nodded, her heart swelling with an unfamiliar sense of purpose. Perhaps Harold had been right all along. Perhaps, for the first time in her life, she was where she was supposed to be. Clara spent the following weeks adjusting to her new life at the mansion, finding herself oscillating between curiosity and confusion. She spent her days in silence, her time divided between wandering the estate, reading the books Harold had suggested, and attending to the formalities of their arrangement. While Harold remained an enigmatic figure, always wrapped in the calm control of his world, Clara's unease began to fade. She was beginning to understand that this life, however strange, could offer her more than just security. There was potential here for growth, for transformation, even for meaning. It was on one such afternoon that Clara overheard a conversation that would change everything. She had been walking past the study when she heard Harold's voice, low and serious, speaking to one of his financial advisors. She hesitated for a moment, not wanting to intrude, but something in the tone of the conversation caught her attention. Stepping closer, She couldn't help but listen. Her curiosity piqued. "Have we cleared the last of the medical bills for Clara's mother?" Harold asked. The words hit Clara like a wave. Her breath caught in her throat, and she instinctively backed away from the door, her heart pounding in her chest. Her mind raced. Harold had paid off her mother's medical bills without her knowing. The thought was overwhelming. She had always thought of their arrangement as a strictly business affair, one where there was no space for compassion. But this gesture, this quiet act of kindness, made her question everything. Unable to contain her curiosity, Clara found herself seeking Harold out later that day. She found him in the sitting room, gazing out over the estate as the sun set. His presence was commanding, even in the quiet of the evening, and Clara felt a twinge of uncertainty. She wasn't sure how to bring up what she had overheard, but the need for answers was too great. "Harold," Clara began, her voice unsteady, "I overheard your conversation earlier. About my mother's bills, you paid them off." Harold turned, his expression unreadable. "I thought you should know. It was the least I could do. Your mother has been through a lot." Clara stood frozen, a whirlwind of emotions rushing through her. She felt grateful, confused, and even a little guilty. "But why? Why would you do that for me? For my family? This isn't part of our arrangement." Harold regarded her with a calm, almost thoughtful expression. "I don't do things out of charity, Clara," he said quietly. "I help those who show potential, who are capable of more than they believe. You have more to offer than you realize. And I believe in helping people find that potential." The words lingered in the air, heavy with meaning. Clara had always seen Harold as a wealthy businessman, an older man who had made an arrangement out of convenience. But now, she was seeing him in a new light. He wasn't just providing for her. He was nurturing her potential, giving her the chance to become someone greater than the woman who had walked into his life that day. "I don't know what to say," Clara whispered, her voice shaky. "I've never had anyone do something like this for me before." Harold gave a slight smile, the first real one Clara had seen from him in all the time she had known him. "You don't need to say anything. Just know that you're not alone. And I'm not asking for anything in return. Not yet, anyway." Clara's heart swelled with a mixture of gratitude and confusion. She had never expected this quiet, unspoken kindness that seemed to be Harold's way of showing that he saw her as more than just a companion. He saw her as someone worth investing in, someone whose future mattered. The weight of that realization was both humbling and empowering. In the days that followed, Clara found herself looking at her life differently. She wasn't just a waitress who had been offered a deal for financial security. She was someone with potential, someone who could make a difference. And perhaps, just perhaps, Harold was the catalyst she needed to finally begin believing in herself. Clara's days at Harold's mansion began to take on new meaning as the days turned into weeks. With each passing moment, she felt a growing sense of purpose that had been absent from her life before. As she learned more about Harold's philanthropic work, she began to realize that her life could be more than just a passive existence in the shadows of his wealth. She could be part of something bigger, something that wasn't just about surviving but about making a real difference in the lives of others. One afternoon, Harold invited Clara to join him on a visit to one of the community centers he had funded. It was a humble space, far removed from the grandeur of the mansion, but it was buzzing with energy and life. Children ran through the halls, laughing and playing, while adults engaged in various programs aimed at helping the underprivileged in the area. It was a place where hope was cultivated, where people who had been written off by society found a second chance. As Harold led her through the building, Clara was struck by the sense of purpose that filled the air. The people here weren't just receiving handouts, they were being given the tools to change their own lives. Harold's foundation wasn't just about charity, it was about empowerment, about creating opportunities for those who might otherwise have been left behind. "This is what it's all about," Harold said as they walked through the center, his voice filled with quiet pride. "We don't just give people what they need in the moment. We help them build a future for themselves. That's the real legacy we're creating here, Clara." Clara listened closely, her mind whirring with new ideas. She had never thought about philanthropy in this way before. For so long, her own life had been defined by struggle, by the need to simply get by. But now, Standing in the midst of a community that was actively changing their own fate, Clara saw a new path. A path where she could be more than just a beneficiary of Harold's generosity. She could be an active participant, someone who made a difference. As they left the center, Harold turned to her with a glint of understanding in his eyes. "I can see it in you, Clara," he said quietly. "You have the ability to lead, to take charge of something that matters." Clara's heart raced as his words sank in. Could she really do this? Could she truly make an impact? She wasn't sure yet, but something inside her stirred. Perhaps this was the opportunity she had been waiting for. An opportunity to use her experiences, her struggles, to help others who were walking the same difficult path she had once walked. "I want to help," Clara said, her voice filled with newfound resolve. "I want to be part of something like this. I want to give back." Harold's smile was small but genuine. "I thought you might feel that way," he said, his voice warm with approval. "I've already started a project for single mothers in need of housing. I think it's time for you to take the lead on it." Clara was speechless. The thought of taking on such a responsibility was both exhilarating and terrifying, but as she stood there, surrounded by the hum of possibility, she knew that this was her moment. The woman who had walked into Harold's life as a waitress was beginning to emerge as someone entirely different, someone capable of making a real difference in the world. And so, with Harold's quiet encouragement and belief in her, Clara took her first steps toward a life she had never imagined, one filled with purpose, growth, and the potential to change the world around her. Clara's world had shifted dramatically over the past few months. The woman who had walked into Harold's life as a humble waitress was no longer the same person. With each passing day, she grew stronger, more confident, more capable. The project for single mothers was just the beginning, but it felt like the first real test of her potential, a trial that she knew could change everything. At first, Clara had struggled with the weight of the responsibility. She wasn't used to being the one in charge, to making decisions that impacted others' lives. But with Harold's guidance and unwavering support, she began to believe in herself. He had entrusted her with the housing project not as a mere task but as a challenge that would help her realize just how much she was capable of. Over the next few weeks, Clara threw herself into the project with determination. She met with architects, consulted with social workers, and researched the best ways to create an environment where single mothers could thrive. The weight of it all was overwhelming at times, but there was a fire inside her now, one that kept her going even when the road ahead seemed unclear. Harold, who had once been a distant figure in her life, had become a mentor, a guide, and a friend. He watched her closely but rarely intervened, allowing her the space to find her own way. She began to understand why Harold had chosen her for this project. He saw in her something she hadn't fully recognized in herself. She wasn't just a woman in need of help. She was a force in the making. As the project progressed, Clara found herself making decisions with more confidence. She navigated the challenges of fundraising, managed the ever-growing list of contractors and volunteers, and developed relationships with the women who would ultimately benefit from the housing. Each step she took was a reminder that she was no longer just surviving. She was thriving. One afternoon, as Clara stood in the middle of the construction site, surveying the progress of the new homes, Harold approached her. His presence was always commanding, yet today, there was something different in his gaze. A quiet pride, perhaps? "You're doing well," Harold said, his voice low but filled with approval. Clara glanced at him, her heart racing. It had been weeks since he had offered her such direct praise, and hearing it now made her feel like the work she was doing truly mattered. "I'm learning," she said, a modest smile tugging at her lips. "I'm starting to see the bigger picture. This is what I was meant to do." Harold nodded, his expression thoughtful. "I always knew you had it in you, but now, I'm seeing you become the woman I hoped you'd be. Don't stop now, Clara. The world needs leaders like you." Her chest tightened with emotion. These words, these simple, encouraging words, had the power to change everything. They made her realize that Harold wasn't just investing in her project. He was investing in her. He believed in her. And perhaps, for the first time, Clara truly believed in herself too. As the weeks passed, Clara's independence grew. She made more decisions on her own, her confidence swelling with each successful outcome. Harold continued to guide her from behind the scenes, but it was clear he was stepping back, allowing Clara to lead with grace and authority. She had grown into the role he had envisioned for her, and with every challenge she overcame, she became more and more capable. The housing project was nearing completion, and with it, Clara's transformation. She was no longer the scared, uncertain woman who had arrived at Harold's mansion seeking refuge. She was a leader, someone who was carving out her own place in the world, someone who had the strength to change lives. One evening, as Clara and Harold sat on the terrace overlooking the estate, they spoke in the soft glow of the setting sun. Clara was filled with a quiet sense of accomplishment, but also with anticipation for what was to come. "I've come a long way, haven't I?" Clara said, her voice reflective. "You've come farther than I could have hoped for," Harold replied. "But this is just the beginning. You have the potential to do so much more. You're ready for it." Clara's heart swelled. She had known that this moment was coming, but hearing Harold say it out loud made it feel all the more real. She was ready. Ready to lead, ready to take on the world, and ready to make a difference in a way that would leave a lasting legacy. The day of the housing project's grand opening had finally arrived. The once empty plots of land were now filled with beautiful homes. Homes for single mothers who had nowhere else to turn. Homes where they could rebuild their lives and create futures for their children. It was a day that Clara had been working toward for months, a culmination of all the long hours, sleepless nights, and endless meetings. And as she stood there, looking out over the crowd that had gathered for the celebration, she couldn't help but feel overwhelmed by the weight of it all. The mansion's grand ballroom had been transformed into a venue for the event, with large windows overlooking the estate and the new housing complex. There were speeches to be made, acknowledgments to be given, and of course, the ceremony to officially mark the completion of the project. Clara stood at the front of the room, dressed in a simple but elegant dress, her hands trembling slightly as she held a glass of champagne. It had been Harold's idea to host a celebration in honor of the women who would be moving into the new homes, as well as those who had contributed to the success of the project. Clara was a little nervous about being the center of attention, but she couldn't deny that there was something deeply gratifying about seeing the fruits of her labor come to life. As the evening progressed, Harold took the stage to give his opening speech. His words were measured, his voice steady and commanding, as he spoke of the importance of philanthropy and the power of community. But then, to Clara's surprise, he turned to her and beckoned her to join him on stage. "Tonight," Harold said, his gaze resting on Clara, "we celebrate not just a project, but the woman who has made it all possible. Clara has worked tirelessly, dedicating herself to the cause and ensuring that every detail was attended to. Without her vision and leadership, this day would not have come." The room fell silent as Harold's words sank in. Clara's heart pounded in her chest, and for a moment, she felt as though she might be swallowed up by the weight of the moment. But then, she stepped forward, her legs steady as she walked to the stage. Harold placed a hand on her shoulder, a silent gesture of support, and Clara turned to face the crowd. She felt a surge of gratitude for the people in this room. People who had supported her, believed in her, and helped her make her vision a reality. But most of all, she felt grateful to Harold, the man who had given her the opportunity to grow and to lead. "I don't know what to say," Clara began, her voice shaking slightly, but gaining strength with each word. "This project started as just an idea, but with the help of so many incredible people, it's become something real, something that will change lives." The applause that followed was deafening. Clara felt her cheeks flush, but there was a quiet pride in her heart. She had done it. She had led this project to success, and in doing so, she had found herself. And when Harold announced that Clara would now lead his philanthropic foundation, the applause grew even louder. It was official. Clara was no longer just a participant in Harold's world. She was at the helm. And as the evening drew to a close, with the sound of laughter and celebration filling the air, Clara couldn't help but feel that this was the beginning of something truly extraordinary. The grand celebration had come to an end, and the mansion, once filled with laughter and conversation, now stood quiet under the soft glow of the moon. Clara, though exhausted, was not ready to retreat to her room just yet. She walked slowly through the corridors, her thoughts swirling. The weight of the day's events still pressed upon her. Today had been a milestone, not just for the project, but for her personal journey. She had come so far since the first day Harold had walked into her life. The woman who had once felt like a stranger to the world of wealth and influence had now found her place. Standing in front of the crowd earlier, when Harold had introduced her as the new head of his philanthropic foundation, Clara had felt like a completely different person. A person worthy of such a responsibility. Her hand lightly brushed the marble columns as she continued walking, almost as if she was searching for something. Some sign that everything was real. The mansion, the celebration, the applause, Harold's unwavering belief in her. It was all real. But was she ready for what was coming next? Clara reached the library, the place where she had spent many quiet moments with Harold. Reading, talking, or simply being in the same room, the connection between them growing stronger over time. She pushed open the heavy wooden door and stepped inside. The room was empty, save for a few flickering lights and the shelves stacked with books. Her gaze fell upon the leather-bound journals on the desk, Harold's journals. Clara had never read them. She had never felt the need to, until now. There was so much she didn't know about Harold, the man who had become both her mentor and, in many ways, the father she had never had. She picked one up, feeling the weight of it in her hands, and opened to the first page. The handwriting was elegant, purposeful. In that moment, Clara realized something. Harold's foundation, the projects, the legacy, it wasn't just about money. It was about purpose. He had spent his life cultivating that purpose, sharing it with those who could carry it forward. And now, it was her turn to take up the mantle. Her mind wandered back to their conversation earlier that evening, when Harold had spoken to her about their shared journey. They hadn't just built houses for single mothers, they had built hope. And in that moment of reflection, Clara understood that Harold's belief in her wasn't simply about her ability to manage his wealth or legacy. It was about her ability to continue his work in a way that could change lives. A soft knock on the door interrupted her thoughts. Clara looked up to find Harold standing in the doorway, his frame silhouetted by the hallway light. "Clara," he said, his voice calm but carrying a depth of emotion that made her pause. "Do you have a moment?" Clara smiled and gestured for him to come inside. "Of course." He stepped into the room, his hands behind his back, as though contemplating something important. He stood by the desk for a moment, glancing down at the open journal. "I see you found my journals," he said, his tone tinged with amusement. "I was just reflecting," Clara replied, her voice steady but thoughtful. "Reflecting on everything you've done, everything you've taught me." Harold gave a soft chuckle and placed his hand on her shoulder. "I don't think I've done anything more than show you your own potential, Clara. What you've done here, it's yours. The success, the growth, it's all yours now." She met his gaze, her heart swelling with gratitude. "I couldn't have done it without you, without your belief in me." "You've always had it in you," Harold said, his voice low and sincere. "I knew that from the moment I met you. You're ready now, Clara. You've grown into someone I can proudly leave my legacy with. But remember this, the real work begins now. And you're not alone. You have the people around you, and you have me, even if I'm not around in the way I used to be." Tears welled in Clara's eyes as she stood there, in awe of the man who had given her everything she needed to succeed. "Thank you, Harold. I will make sure your legacy lives on." Harold smiled, his eyes filled with warmth and pride. "I know you will." As they stood there, silent for a moment, Clara felt an overwhelming sense of peace settle in her heart. She wasn't just inheriting a foundation or wealth. She was inheriting the responsibility to create change, to make the world a better place, just as Harold had. It was a gift, and it was one that she would carry with her always. The days following the celebration were a blur of activity, with Clara throwing herself into her new role as head of the foundation. Every day felt like a new challenge, but it was one she was now fully prepared for. Harold had given her all the tools she needed, and his lessons were ingrained in her mind. But the truth was, the hardest challenge was still ahead of her. Harold's health was beginning to decline. It was a slow process, one that no one wanted to acknowledge, but it was inevitable. Clara had always known it was coming, But nothing could prepare her for the moment when she realized just how fragile Harold had become. He had always been a strong, commanding presence in her life, but now she saw the toll that time had taken. He seemed a little weaker each day, his movements more deliberate, his voice quieter. Clara watched as he grew more tired, more withdrawn. The man who had once been a pillar of strength was now in need of care and support. Yet, even as his health waned, Harold never stopped teaching. Their conversations, once filled with grand ideas and ambitious plans, had shifted to quieter, more reflective talks. In these moments, Harold would share stories from his past, about his youth, his struggles, and his greatest successes. Clara would listen intently, soaking in every word, knowing that time was slipping away. One evening, as they sat together in the library, Clara noticed how pale Harold had become. His once vigorous energy had been replaced by a quiet calmness, an acceptance of what was to come. She could feel the weight of the moment, the realization that this might be the last time they would sit together in this way. "Clara," Harold said softly, his voice betraying the weariness that had settled in his bones. "I'm proud of you, more than you'll ever know." Clara looked at him, her heart heavy. "Don't say that, Harold. You've been the one guiding me all this time." Harold smiled, his eyes gleaming with affection. "No, Clara, you've surpassed me. You've become something I could never have imagined. And now, it's your turn to carry the torch. I have no doubt that you'll do great things. But remember, it's not just about the work. It's about the people you help, the lives you touch." Tears welled up in Clara's eyes, and she leaned over, taking Harold's hand in hers. "I'll make you proud. I promise." "You already have," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "Now go and build your legacy. Make it one of kindness, of compassion, of strength." Clara nodded, her chest tightening with emotion. The final lesson had been taught, and it was one that would stay with her forever. Harold had given her everything, his wisdom, his belief, and his legacy. And now, it was her turn to live it, to pass it on, and to carry it forward in her own way. As Harold rested, Clara stood up and walked toward the window. The night was quiet, the stars above gleaming brightly. She felt a deep sense of responsibility wash over her, but it was no longer a burden. It was a privilege. She was ready. The final days of Harold's life were a quiet crescendo, a soft unfolding of what Clara had always known was coming but never wanted to accept. His once boundless energy had given way to frailty. The man who had been the cornerstone of her world was now a shadow of his former self, and as the days passed, Clara found herself facing a new reality, a life without him. She had stayed at his side through the hardest moments, tirelessly caring for him with the same devotion he had shown her in the past. She learned to cherish the small moments, the whispered words of wisdom, the rare smile that would still light up his face when she walked into the room. In the silence of the mansion, it was clear that this would be the final chapter of their journey together. One evening, as the sky bled into hues of purple and gold, Clara sat at Harold's bedside, holding his hand. The air in the room was thick with the unspoken truth that this would be the night. His breath had become shallow, the rhythmic rise and fall of his chest slower than ever before. Clara could feel it in her bones, the finality of it all, but she refused to acknowledge it aloud. "Harold," she whispered, her voice breaking despite her best efforts to remain strong. "You taught me everything. You showed me how to be brave, how to build a life from nothing, how to believe in myself. And most importantly, you showed me the power of kindness." A faint smile flickered on Harold's lips, his eyes barely open, but he still held onto her hand, and it was enough to give Clara a sense of peace. She could feel his love, the quiet strength that had always been there for her, grounding her in a way nothing else ever could. "You've already done the hard part, Clara," he murmured, his voice weak. "You've learned to trust yourself. You've learned to lead with your heart. Don't stop. You know what's right." Tears slid down Clara's face as she nodded, squeezing his hand. "I won't stop. I'll make sure everything we've built together continues to grow. I'll carry your legacy forward, Harold. You'll never be forgotten." Harold's breathing grew slower, but there was a serenity in his face that calmed Clara's racing heart. She knew that this was the end, that he had lived his life with purpose and integrity, and that now it was time for him to rest. With one final, shallow breath, Harold passed away, leaving Clara to face a world without the man who had been her mentor, her guide, and her greatest supporter. The silence that followed was deafening. Clara held his hand for a long time, refusing to let go. She didn't want to admit that he was truly gone, but in her heart, she knew it was time to say goodbye. The funeral was a simple affair. Harold had never been one for extravagance, and Clara respected his wishes. It was attended by close friends, business partners, and many of the people who had been touched by Harold's generosity over the years. Clara stood at the front, a picture of strength, though inside, she felt as though a piece of her had been ripped away. But despite the overwhelming grief, there was something else she felt, a deep sense of gratitude. Gratitude for every lesson, every piece of advice Harold had given her. Gratitude for the belief he had placed in her when no one else did. She knew that Harold's legacy was not just in the wealth he had accumulated, but in the lives he had touched, the community he had built, and the hope he had instilled in those around him. In the weeks that followed, Clara threw herself into the work that Harold had started. She continued to manage the foundation, overseeing the housing projects for single mothers, the scholarships for underprivileged children, and the community programs that had been his pride and joy. She worked tirelessly, honoring his memory with every decision she made, ensuring that the impact of his life would continue for generations to come. It was during one of her visits to a new housing development that Clara realized the full weight of what Harold had left behind. She stood on the porch of a small, newly built home, watching a young mother and her children move in. The woman smiled at Clara, her eyes filled with gratitude, and it struck Clara just how many lives had been changed because of Harold's vision. This was what he had wanted, to give people the tools to build a better life for themselves. Clara knew she was on the right path. She had found her purpose in continuing Harold's work, but she also knew that she had to forge her own way. Harold had given her the foundation, but now it was her turn to build something even greater. Years passed, and the foundation grew. The projects expanded, and Clara's influence began to spread far beyond the walls of Harold's mansion. She became a respected leader in the community, a woman who had taken the lessons of the past and applied them to create lasting change. But despite all of her success, there was never a moment when Clara forgot where she had come from. She never forgot the waitress who had walked into Harold's life, uncertain of what the future held. She never forgot the man who had believed in her when no one else did, who had seen potential in her where others saw nothing. One evening, as Clara stood at the podium during the annual charity gala, looking out at the crowd of supporters, she felt a familiar presence by her side. She glanced to the empty seat next to her, the chair where Harold used to sit, and smiled softly to herself. She was still carrying his legacy, but she was also building her own. "Thank you," she said into the microphone, her voice steady and clear. "Thank you for believing in what Harold and I have built. But more than that, thank you for believing in the power of hope, the power of kindness, and the power of one person to change the world." The room erupted in applause, and Clara felt a sense of peace wash over her. Harold was gone, but his spirit was still alive in every life she touched, in every project she managed, in every person who had been helped by the foundation. She smiled, knowing that Harold's legacy would never die. It lived on in her, in the foundation, and in the hope that continued to spread from the work they had started together. And for the first time since his passing, Clara felt truly at peace. Harold Whitmore had left her everything: his belief, his wisdom, and his legacy. But now, Clara had something new: the knowledge that she, too, was capable of creating a legacy of her own, one that would endure long after she was gone. The story of Clara and Harold serves as a testament to the invisible yet powerful change one person can bring to the world, even through the smallest of actions. From a poor waitress, Clara rose to become a skilled leader with compassion, not only to carry on Harold's legacy, but to create one of her own. The lessons of trust, resilience, and kindness never ceased to resonate within them. Throughout her journey, Clara learned that a legacy is not just about material wealth, but about the values and opportunities we provide to others. The connections between people, the help we offer, and the love we give are never lost, and at times, they are the most powerful forces to change the world. Harold may have passed, but what he left behind, both in terms of material wealth and spirit, will forever live in the hearts of those he touched. And Clara, now no longer just his heir but the bearer of hope, continues to spread it where it is needed most. As Harold taught, only change and compassion can make a difference. And Clara proved that, no matter how challenging the journey, with belief and determination, one person can create an everlasting impact. Thus, the story of Clara and Harold comes to an end, but the legacy they built, the love, resilience, and selflessness, lives on, continuing to change lives and touch hearts along the way. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen to Clara and Harold's story. Your presence and support mean the world to us. We hope this journey has touched your heart and inspired you, just as it has inspired us. If you enjoyed this story and would like to hear more, please don't forget to hit the like button, share this video, and subscribe to our channel for more amazing content. Your feedback and support help us grow and bring more stories that move and inspire. We truly appreciate you being a part of this experience. Until next time, stay inspired, stay kind, and keep believing in the power of change. Thank you again for watching.